I'm only gonna do one poem. I'm gonna read a poem from Birthright. It's a poem, again, thinking about the way I want poetry to write against institutions of memory, institutions that are suppressing Palestinian memory. How can a poetry become a vessel and embody a vessel of Palestinian memory, memory in the body, memory in the archive. I don't read this poem aloud a lot because it exhausts me. But also just I think there's something spiritual about reading poems into the air. And like last time I read this poem was 2 years ago when Marwa came up from New York and we read together at Harvard Bookstore. And there was just something about this space that I was like, I read this poem in that space. And I'm like, this is not the space I want to read the poem in. And so there hasn't been a space I've wanted to read this poem in for those 2 years and until this one. So thank you, Nada, for creating this space. Begins with an epigraph. There is no loneliness when you have the whole world inside of you. Vanessa Meng. Against consolidation. I want to write about the blueberries I picked from the throat of a New England fall afternoon. How my hands plucked each branch like a familiar melody, and suddenly it is 2008. I am small and unremarkable, standing in a blueberry orchard in Northern California with my cousins. Maybe summer is a form of muscle memory. I want to write a poem about muscle memory, a phenomenon which, after decades of studies, still doesn't have a complete explanation. One theory suggests these memories undergo consolidation, the process of stabilization from short to long-term memory. Perhaps we can infer the existence of a thing without knowing its eternal structure. Perhaps our bodies remember a music by the hollow dancing it leaves behind. Many mathematical proofs of existence cannot explicitly construct their objects of interest. One tool for such proofs of existence is the axiom of choice. Metaphorically speaking, it too is a form of unconscious memory. It states that given a tree with an unimaginable number of branches, it is still possible to pluck one blueberry from each branch. That's not the point. I'm saying choice is not inherent to every system of logic. The first time I learned this was not in the context of math or countries or bodies. I want to write about my country and mean country, silly tithe, forgiving sacrifice. I want to write a poem about home and not have to mean country or death, or how easily the two can be mistaken for one another. One could say this is a consequence of neither concept being well defined. Logical assumptions of the axiom of choice can lead to pathological behaviors that violate our conceptions of mass, space, and time. For instance, it is possible to decompose one sphere into two identical spheres, hence four, hence infinitely many. From one life springs two, hence four, hence infinitely many. One could say death is poorly defined in such a logical framework. Or perhaps death is an unobservable construction. Consider, for instance, the ancestors resurrected in every poem. How I was fluent in the language of their death before ever being fluent in the Arabic they spoke before me. And this is not, and is this not the job of the poet, much like mathematicians, to give language to that which cannot be constructed, to uneviscerate flesh, to give muscle memory to every chaos of limbs? 1998, my earliest memory is being lost in a sea of cousins at my Christmas party. I do not stand out from the crowd until the dead kiss starts, the music shaking the floor beneath my feet, and I dance like there is no earthquake beneath me. I dance and part my cousins like every ocean split before me. Like my body knew I was Palestinian before I did. Or maybe it was the lurch of my gut the last time I visited my queer aunt's unmarked grave. How even in remembrance, her ghost is but an erasure of a former self. It is important to mention the last person I loved was buried in the same cemetery just yards away, and yet I have spanned entire galaxies and failed poems trying to reconstruct her laughter. How we remember not the beloved, but the music they leave behind. How the last time I visited her grave, the gray skies parted, no metaphor, leaking light for the first time all week, and in coincidence or in faith, I am inclined to call that grace. I want to write about tiny miracles. I woke up this morning. I woke up this morning. One could call it an instance of pathological behavior, or maybe the first pathological behavior was when I mentioned the word country, or the space between countries and bodies in line 6. Perhaps, since this is a poem about memory, it is discontinuous by necessity. There are hands, hence there will always be breakage. Neurological theory argues against some forms of consolidation, says some memories never stabilize, but are encoded in parallel architectures. This suggests we encode reality in multiplicities. Every perception of reality is, by construction, a multiverse of complexity. I want to write about the first Palestinian I met in grad school like she wasn't a miracle. Or maybe every Palestinian is a parallel universe. I want to write about New Year's Eve in Bethlehem, the house swelling with cousins and their pillow fight laughter. I want to talk about George, who was always the first to throw the pillows, but had the sweetest face when his mother came around. His father outside roasting kebab, talking about those fuckers and their checkpoints ruining our morning commute. And Natalie, who paraded her hand-stitched thobes throughout the house like she owned the place, and in the same breath lectured us on God's grace, how Jesus cured her cancer before the chemo could. I want to talk about Nadia, who knew more English than her mother, but still counted down to midnight in Arabic, the whole house dancing to a music they didn't know, but understood. I want to remember my homeland this way, the city alight, but not ablaze. I want to write about nights in Palestine where the last thing we thought about was death, about being smoked out in Ramallah like she knows she'll rise with a steel-tipped boot to the face. This reality exists without saying. Give us tonight to dance without words. Let me remember first the dance and not the ensuing exile. Let me write about home without writing its unbecoming. And I confess, I spent too much time revolving around my own unbecoming, the way time dilates around a black hole, reality diverging at the point where not even light escapes. I confess, dear reader, dear audience, that you all have become my latest test subjects. Yes, this specimen is biting back. I speak not of this poem, but the memory of it, the parallel worlds your mind will inhabit, patching together my every image in your universe of perception. I mean, and in that universe, there will always be a Palestine with children laughing. Men have turned entire countries into test subjects without their consent. Neither the men nor the countries are named in this poem, so as to restrict them from the universe of this poem, and it follows. Every poem is a false god of sorts, maybe not in sin, but in the confession of it. The unraveling between poem and reality and perception of poem. I began this poem with blueberries, with muscle memory and hands, or maybe I never had control over the narrative. Being ill-defined, the system does not converge. When I say the system does not converge, his hands smelled like blueberries. California 2008, the system does not converge. I am small and insignificant. The system, Philadelphia 2015, yes, he made a massacre of me. Yes, I was his for the taking. Does not converge. I am small. Converge. I am insignificant. The poem is circling back. The system does not converge and diverging. The poem is assuming convergence, multiple convergent realities, meanings. The system does not converge. The hands, the system fails. The poem intersects with converging the realities of the reader. The poem remembers the system does not, what the reader cannot. The hands converge. The system does not converge. Always the hands. The poem remembers always the hands. The system does not converge. The system does not converge. The poem does not converge. The poem fails to converge.